Ace Combat 7 is objectively one of the weakest mainline Ace Combat games. I'm sure there are plenty who don't agree. I'm sure some people will already think, but hey, wait, I enjoyed it. Great, you were able to look past the flaws. For a long time, people said Ace Combat 5 was the best, and some still do. I will say it's better than 7 in some big ways, but it's the same point. I don't care about popularity. I don't care about your subjective experience. The point is, some people were just happy to see this franchise come back. Some people can ride emotional attachment right into a trash fire. I can't. An emotional attachment is no substitution for the problems we have here in front of us. Some so direct, I think plenty felt them even if they could not put them into words. Now at the same time though, this is not just some subjective take. It's not an incensed emotional slam poetry session. Will I get angry? Oh hell yeah, I will get angry. But we are going to be kind of surgical here. We're going to go through this whole thing piece by piece by piece, show you exactly what I mean. That being said, I'm not CinemaSins. If I cite a specific example, it is as endemic of a larger conceptual problem. If I only did each and every single error in Ace Combat 7, this video will be 6 hours long, and I don't have the time to make that, and you are already probably sweating at like the over hour-long video ahead of you. Also, once again, as always, when I see something of merit, I will compliment it. But the sting of 7's flaws is the sting of wasted potential and a mess of elements. I've gone through this whole series for just this reason, to draw parallels, draw comparison, and show logical, consistent argumentation by pattern. One of my favorite things to do after playing a game is reading up on the background of just how it got made. If you are really lucky, you'll even find a retrospective dev assessment document. Basically a nice, hey, we made the thing, well, what went right? What went wrong? Kind of article. In addition to reasserting my point, I will also at the end conclude with just such a concise assessment. Now, do I actually think anyone from Project Aces will see this? Probably not, and it's also probably going to be in English until somebody translates it, but they might very well be aware of some of these issues. This video will try to concisely and succinctly highlight these problems as much as possible. Once more, I will get angry, because these problems make me angry. But this is, first and foremost, a vivisection of exactly how and why, piece by piece, Ace Combat 7 was disappointing. Before we get into the game proper, before we even start describing it, I think I need to first begin with something else. We have to lay the foundation for how we got here. Before we can even begin to get into the game itself, I would say it's absolutely important to understand the background of who made it and how it got made, and of the issues of returning to franchises after times have changed. Namco as a company was first formed in 1955. Like many eventual video game companies, like Nintendo, its origins lie in much older forms of entertainment, like mechanical fairground arcade machines. Naturally, as the computer revolution swept over Japan, these companies were drawn to these new forms of entertainment. Released in 1988, the Namco System 21 arcade board would be not only fully dedicated to polygonal graphics as opposed to the pixel-based, it would be in essence the most powerful piece of gaming hardware in arcades until Sega's Model 1 in 1992. Hit titles like Galaxian 3 and Starblade would make amazing use of the System 21's visual abilities. You might be wondering why this relates to Ace Combat 7. Well, because it's a game whose flaws in history are tied into technology and money, because something else used the System 21 and would come out in 1992. This is in essence the earliest route. Flight sims were burning onto the scene with actual ability to finally portray 3D aircraft and model a sense of how their movement functioned. What is important to mention though is that Project Aces did not exist. Over the subsequent 10 years, the production of this rough group of artists, level designers, and composers who worked on many Namco games would mark this first period with a kind of shared DNA. It also shared its DNA heavily with Ridge Racer, in the form of production staff, engine, and visual style. Ace Combat 3 seems like a much more advanced game compared to these initial games, but in terms of the initial technology at the core of it, it was largely the same stuff. Reused Ridge Racer engines and adapted creative assets for both. But this really came to a head with what you probably already know, the PlayStation 2. Metal Gear Solid 2 was famous for its level of detail and for truly maximizing the hardware of the PlayStation 2. But something else was happening, something at the same time most people did not likely care too much of. Metal Gear Solid 2 had a budget of a development cost of $10 million. Not cheap for the Japanese market, roughly about as much as a Godzilla movie at the same time. Meanwhile, other titles like Half-Life 2 had budgets as high as $40 million. The world was changing, and times were changing with it. Project AC4 was established within Namco. This group consisted of many key members who had already worked and developed previous titles beforehand. What they created I have already talked on, but the key point was that it worked. They slimmed down all the elements of 3 while keeping its style and ended with a fantastic success. And as far as history might show, that success might remain as the highest point of Ace Combat, potentially forever, because times kept changing, things kept moving, and the kind of game Ace Combat was, combined with the size of its market and how it could possibly sell to, were not so friendly. With Ace Combat 5, Project Aces realized fundamentally that those who wanted pure jet arcade sims would probably not need another one so soon. The gameplay was what these people wanted, and they had it. So why not change the approach? Focus on an ambitious story, have a simpler flight system so that more people, and maybe younger people who otherwise found 4s too difficult, could gain access to it. And why not have wingmen as well to help the player out? In addition to this, ultimately I voiced my issues with 5. These wingmen never worked out as well as one would hope, and the story, while ambitious, was largely a collection of paper-thin or outright annoying characters, tied into a juvenile drama wadding through heavy-handed pacifism and an idiotic plot. Did it attract younger players who could not handle 4? Yes. And perhaps, if you were young enough, it could succeed in giving the impression of a deeper story where a weak one actually existed. But time kept moving, and the world kept spinning. Ace Combat 5 did do well enough, but it still fell short of Ace Combat 4's supremacy, and still fell even below Air Combat, but Project Aces moved on. Ace Combat's next 2 projects were developed likely very closely between one another, judging by their release dates. Zero would be handled by a smaller team in order to make one final PS2 game. In many ways, Zero is the Halo ODST of this franchise. A smaller team working on reused assets and a pre-established engine would cost less to work from. Because of this, they as well gained more creative freedom. It is no coincidence that Zero's strength of story and strong direction were likely tied to the fact that it was not written by or directed by the same people as 5. These people still mostly came from within Project Aces, and some worked on 5, but Zero seems to be exactly the response to the issues 5 had, not just in its mechanics, but in story as well. Zero is not just a prequel to 5, or the setup to it. Zero feels like the reaction to 5's problems and its weaknesses, but it did do less, and ironically ended up with some of the lowest sales in the mainline series on the PS2. It's hard to say if it was made at a loss without knowing the development cost, but while Ace Combat 4 had many chips stacked in its favor, Ace Combat 0 did not, and once again time kept moving, and the sun was setting on the PS2. This meant something else though. The industry as it had been in 2000 was not the same as it was in 2006. Budgets had broadly kept increasing. 06 to 07 would be the year in video games of green. Halo Combat Evolved had been, to the Xbox, a pillar of its very reason for existing, something the original Ace Combat had to the PS1. Halo 3 was launching, and so was the Xbox 360, and with it came Microsoft, eyeing expansion into the East. Microsoft had cash and wondered if it could cut into Sony's home territory. So like Commodore Matthew Perry, they were going to come in and open it up for business. Their strategy was simple: try and shift the material of the PS2, some of its hardcore staples that worked out well, JRPGs like Final Fantasy and arcade titles like Ace Combat, onto it. Its method was simple: money. Some of these attempts produced interesting results. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been the producer and designer of many classic Final Fantasy games like 7, came on to work on Lost Odyssey, which would be an Xbox 360 exclusive. Unfortunately, the days of JRPG's supremacy was much like Ace Combat, not the titan it once was, though it would ironically fare far better in the long run. But something else was working here. It's our old friend technology. From the outside, the switch of Project Aces to deving for the Xbox 360 seems like a terrible idea, but in truth there's more depth to it. The PS3 had a notoriously nasty architecture. Everyone from Gabe Newell to Sony's own goddamn CEO at the time admitted it was a machine that was a pain in the ass to develop for, seemingly to get the most out of developers, which personally sounds like an excuse for a botched series of mistakes. It's time to mention what might be one of the 2 biggest villains of this story. A lot of people probably remember September 25th, 2007. However, something pretty important to Ace Combat and Japanese video games happened on March 31st, 2006. A Friday most of us were probably boringly wishing school would be done or for work to come to an end. Off in the distant land of Japan, 2 titans were merging. Their names were Bandai and Namco. If you don't already know, Bandai is the 3rd largest toy company in existence. It is well known for a little thing called Gunpla, which, if you know, is the tie-in model kits for Gundam. In addition, a certain company called Sunrise is also owned under the Bandai Namco holdings. You may have heard of them. They mainly are known as being one of the biggest animation studios in Japan and being behind the massive franchise called Gundam. What, you think Ace Combat Gundam Link was merely a narrative comparison or the product of hack writers? Nope, they are owned by distant tentacles of the same megacorp. Its name is shortened to Bamco, but make no mistake, it's a behemoth of a company. Sunrise makes the anime, Bandai makes the plastic toys, and Namco makes the games. So how does this get back to Project Aces and Ace Combat? Simple. The teams that make things in a large company are like its organs, and when companies merge, redundant organs are purged, as with what happened to Banpresto's video game division. Project Aces and the Namco staff are also likely shoveled heavily during this merger. Don't be too nostalgic. If there's one thing I want to get across here, it's that the rule is always don't trust the fucking corpse. Companies are a means to an end. They have creative great people, but also assholes. Our priority as a consumer is their games, animation, and art. Their priority outside of their creative organs is profit. So finally we return to Ace Combat 6. Looking at the landscape of the time, a declining flight arcade genre, a huge boost in first-person shooters, Microsoft showing up with bags of money, and it's willing to pay, Ace Combat 6 a new engine, and not only is Microsoft going to cover the development overhead, their platform is easier to develop for in comparison to the new and difficult PlayStation 3. As much as I'm sure the shift in consoles pissed off many PlayStation fanboys, and they complained en masse, putting all the pieces together shows that the jump made sense from a developing perspective, even if in retrospect it seems to make little sense. Sadly, even with 6's merits, the core fan base was left behind on the PlayStation. Such as it was, either Ace Combat 6 attracted new players, or garnered the few players who had already committed to buying an Xbox 360. And after that, after 6's sales being lower than zero, Assault Horizon sales shot back up over the millions for the first time since Ace Combat 5. The problem is, Assault Horizon is fundamentally not really Ace Combat anymore. Its setting is not Strange Rail, and its gameplay is a dramatic change. I don't count it really because as much as Ace Combat 3 gets rejected for its style and setting, it's still firmly in Strange Rail. Assault Horizon is in comparison not only in the real world, at that point it's wholly an altered beast, and the world kept changing, and time kept going by, and now we finally get to the development of Ace Combat 7, but the same two big factors are in play, technology and money, and they affect the three big things that have changed a hell of a lot since Ace Combat 6's time: creative ability, greed, and budget. In order to understand the conditions that led to the problems of Ace Combat 7, it is important to focus in even closer on the pressures it faced and why its production ended up happening the way it did. First, we need to zoom in on the current landscape. Specifically, the point here is about the rise of free-to-play games. As you might know, the thing that garnered the return of interest for Ace Combat was Ace Combat Infinity, a free-to-play online multiplayer-focused Ace Combat, created by Project Aces and published by Namco. For 4 years between 2014 and 2018, the primary thing holding together Project Aces and Ace Combat as a brand was Ace Combat Infinity. The reason Ace Combat Infinity existed and the reason Ace Combat 7 faced so much pressure under its development are deeply tied. These two things I've been mentioning were integral. On the one hand, graphical fidelity went up dramatically around the turn of the millennium. While people oogled at the pretty graphics, it had many far more negative knock-on effects. On the one hand, technology was inevitably going to hit diminishing returns. As with any tech, as time goes on, the massive leaps forward once seen as the norm, as in the Sega versus Nintendo versus PlayStation period, could not be kept up. Ironically, this also applies to fighter jets. Unfortunately, as a side effect, this meant that while a greater and greater visual detail was possible, the effort needed was increasing far faster. As an example, the PlayStation 2 games use plane skins that are around 500 pixels. Ace Combat 7, on the other hand, has its plane skins being around 1,000 pixels. As early as the beginning of this decade, there was speculations over the plateau in graphics in terms of even AAA development. It's a hotly debated topic on how much further already expensive consoles or PC hardware can realistically push this idealistic pursuit of the photoreal. As I speak this, Nvidia is gambling a good amount on how well ray tracing rendering will become a benchmark. But with their graphics card cost already exceedingly expensive, the cost is abundantly apparent. Now the knock-on effects are really the priority here though. You don't need to remember specific numbers really, just the key points. 1. Graphical fidelity has increased. 2. Development for these new platforms is more intensive due to the hardware complexity needed. And lastly, 3. In comparison to the rate of graphical advancement present previously in the current decade, while still showing a slight increase, it is not as aggressive, mainly due to the diminishing returns from technology. But what about the knock-on effects I mentioned? Here is where things basically go south, and don't worry, all of this will be heavily related back into Ace Combat, and you will understand very soon. As I'm sure you are aware, the real factor is the other half, money. Games are of course more than just their graphics. Games require a multitude of other factors like story, soundtrack, characters, and so on. Once upon a time in a period when Namco was just produced arcade machines, the priority of these factors was not high. Obviously, if you only have 10 minutes on a machine with a set of quarters, you don't want a 15-minute Metal Gear Solid cutscene. But as the shift to home consoles became a thing, the time people could spend on their entertainment increased accordingly. So the room for narrative within these kinds of games also opened up as well. Nothing embodies this more perfectly than the games I've already mentioned. Look at the jump from Ace Combat 2 to Ace Combat 3. It perfectly represents this massive leap in the power of narrative. And after all, why not? A great story helps us believe in the world and commit to the characters. It enhances our experience and makes us truly step into that place. Some may argue for Ace Combat, surely it's an arcade game still. How important can the story be? And I would simply say it's basically the thing that most fans latch onto, the thing that makes us forget we have in essence basically been playing the same gameplay with some slight differences for over 20 years. But now it's time to sober up a bit, because things have gotten a bit bleak when it comes to major studios. One of perhaps my all-time favorite survival horror games, Dead Space, was exactly one such victim. It was the product of EA's brief period of funding original IPs. Visceral Games' once renowned survival horror/action franchise ended on what I would say was the last time I was so fundamentally disappointed in a title. One of the things most sidelined by its almost certainly painful production was story. The characters were laughable cardboard cutouts of their previous selves. The drama was so shitty I would not even expect Mexican telenovelas to front it. It was boring and painfully bad. As for the blame as to why, simple. It just wasn't a priority. The heat was on from EA. Dead Space 2 had, as much as it was praised and lauded, and as much as fans loved it, only sold 4 million units, which is, need I remind you, over 1 million more units than even Ace Combat 4's lofty record. But this is where the cost comes in. It cost $60 million to make. Now it's hard to say if this includes or excludes marketing, and in general, development costs are one of the biggest guarded secrets in the industry. But the point is, Dead Space 3 needed to sell 5 million units. That is, more than both best-selling Ace Combat games combined, to even survive to get a sequel. Now this is the brutal example, and EA is certainly ruthless. And now it's time to get to the dark other half of this. Creative ability, greed, and budget. What is fucking vital to understand about the corporate mentality is basically a metaphor George Lucas once used, which I like, and it's very good. It describes basically a calculated risk. The publisher amasses financing for a project, then pays it out to the developer to then make the product. However, something that has been growing in the industry with no doubt is greed. Unbridled greed is not unique to video games, not at all, but games are a booming industry. They surpassed Hollywood sometime last decade and are still growing at an insane rate. But make no mistake, they are a product, and to publishers especially, a booming product at that. This has been, of course, a boom in pure greed as well. EA might be the most notorious, but if you dig deep enough, pretty much most studios, publishers, CEOs, anywhere, the greed is real. You think Trump's brother is a part of ZeniMax because he liked the NES version of Aladdin over the Sega one? Fuck no, they are in it for the green. Money laundering, misuse of funds, treating devs or consumers like garbage. You name it and it's happening. In just half the time of Hollywood, games have already hit the same dastardly bullshit. So I'm sure you're wondering how this all ties together, so here it is. In short, there are 3 factors at play here. Creative ability, that being the drive for a dev to make a specific product, basically the game. Greed, or basically how much wiggle room in financing of that project affords, specifically from the publisher and how much they expect back. And lastly, budget, or how much the project will invariably end up costing. When you keep in mind the money and technology aspects, the pattern that seems to emerge is an obvious one, and one I hope to do more research on and make a full video on for one day. It's not 90s nostalgia really. Period from around the mid-90s to the later half of the first decade of the 2000s saw a very productive combination. Greed of course still existed, but these things were moving so fast technologically that it was still somewhat chaotic time. Technology reached a point where it had a respectable level of fidelity, but was also available to make 3D games more than just a more abstract version as they were previously. Games cost more than they had, and creative pressure was certainly on, but they still had wiggle room for many different games to get made, but at the same level of returns expected for their investment, and their budgets enabled them without being so tightly as to strangle them. But then, after that point, we enter more or less the period we are in now. The technology has leveled off. Greed has grown exceedingly. And here's the kicker for Ace Combat. As greed and budget increase, there is less and less wiggle room. The impetus is for big money in, bigger money out. What, you think it's a coincidence most AAA games have been whittled down to shooting game A, shooting game B, driving game, sports game, open world game flavor ABC? It's the byproduct of all of this. Nice devs? Fuck you. Make games that can get more than 10 million in sales. Can't do that? Go home and play with your kids. This is their mentality, and the point is, the industry and the world that made this, and this became the industry that made this, and this, but then after the turning point of this was very much not the same world and industry anymore. 10 years can do that. And so, finally, you should hopefully be seeing how this all comes together. All of these factors give rise to the conditions for free-to-play games, and most specifically, Ace Combat Infinity. As the greed grows, that pesky initial $60 price tag the industry settled on seems like more and more of a burden. So how can you get around it? Simple. You engineer a system where you remove it entirely, and instead open up ways to suck out way more from people. You hunt for whales. These poor unfortunate souls who either through sheer brand addiction or just, well, normal addiction, dump potentially hundreds or thousands of dollars into their game of choice. $60 is a fucking joke in comparison. If you can get $6 a month, I don't think I need to tell you that after only a year, you've made more money. Of course, this says nothing of DLC, cosmetics, and all the other money-pinching schemes possible. So just for a moment, put yourself in Namco's shoes. You have a franchise which, while quite popular at times, was never the slam dunk of Final Fantasy or Metal Gear. Ace Combat Infinity exists, and then thanks to wondrously generous fucking whales like Duck360 Gaming, who seem to be willing to spend copious amounts on it, you like it. You like money, and it seems to make money. Then, Kazutoki Kono says the best possible thing, given the fan dedication, would be to a new full game, making good on the concept pitched back as early as 2012, that was sidelined in favor of ACI. A game in a series where it essentially had a declining sales since 2001, where a full $60 price would in fact not only net you a purchasing price with no more room for additional profit from the enthusiastic individuals, but additionally it would, unlike the free-to-play model, require an upfront new development period for an engine just to get it back up to Ace Combat's normal gameplay, then more to layer on any additional mechanics needed. And if I've done my job for giving you the context here and you are thinking like a greedy risk-aware publisher taking into account economic potential, yeah, Kono's proposal sounds like not just expensive, but not good, especially considering that since Namco's merger/formation, the company shifted far more priority to the Japanese market, and Ace Combat was definitely a Namco series that was in part very much dependent on international sales. If you need evidence, look no further than the fact that Ace Combat 4 has no Japanese dub, only an English one. And so here we have what can be considered a source of many of the issues with Ace Combat 7, a bunch of presumably middle-aged Japanese salarymen who, judging by Kono's tweets, would unsurprisingly, given their priorities, not want any more Ace Combat games in the vein of Strange Reel, and not want a full game either. I don't want to research a shitload of Namco names and try to guess who was the worst for Kono, so I'm just going to use this random image of, well, this. Some of them might be very nice and friendly folks, but I never trust them, and I'm sure some of them are very greedy assholes, and not nice. Wait, Kono? Who is Kono? At this point, it's about the right time to introduce him and the other most important person to this issue. Kazutoki Kono has basically been the rough caretaker of Project Aces and Ace Combat. While early at Namco, Kono worked as a visual supervisor and art director on Ridge Racer Type 4, and the best comparison I can really make for his role is Tetsuya Nomura of Kingdom Hearts. Now, video game companies are somewhat fluidic, and how someone gets where they are can take a few routes to get there. In Kono's case, like Nomura, it came from the visual side, from the background of familiarizing oneself with the production through the art and creative side. Now, I can't say he's the hero here. Ultimately, he is just another mortal human. But I can say that both nicely Ace Combat's continued existence and unfortunately some of Ace Combat's disappointing outcomes are likely a byproduct of Kono's decisions. But he is not the weakest link in my opinion. His biggest weakness, I would say, is not any mistakes he made, it mainly comes from something else. To understand why, it's time to shed light on the final big person at play. Now, some people mistakenly claim Kono is the Hideo Kojima of Ace Combat. While he does have the supervising aspect of the brand, something is missing. Namely, Kojima's biggest element that distinguishes him from Kono, and perhaps most negatively so, is that he's fundamentally a writer. Story and characters are his shiznit. The visuals he has handled by talented folks like the wonderful Yoji Shinkawa. But Kono is not a writer at all. His background is in the art direction, so he instead has to delegate that to others, or specifically to the final role, Sunao Karabuchi. I don't like this man. Why? You'll fucking hear why, I tell you what. In a nutshell, all you need to know about him is that he was the primary writer for Ace Combat 5. So what I can say right now is Ace Combat 7's development was hard. It was not easy. We can reconstruct an image of its development via articles occasionally published, Kono's interviews and tweets, and the Project Ace's True Sky Tech presentation, and perhaps most usefully, Keystone's data mining. So the development. The image we get is one of a messy, broken up development. Starting 3 years after the initial concept in 2012, after PA had made Ace Combat Infinity, likely at the request of Namco, as ACI launched in 2014, 1 year later, official development started on Ace Combat 7 in 2015. The narrative that emerges is not unique. I brought up Nomura and Kojima for good reason. Kingdom Hearts 3 and Metal Gear Solid 5, in essence, went through a similar issue, a continuation of a franchise after a long leave, coming to terms with new technology, production delays, length, and issues. And I make this comparison for good reason, because all of them were essentially crafted under the same conditions as I outlined before. A different world and industry from the one they left a decade ago. All of them spun off into side projects and handheld titles. In essence, when different beasts evolve under the same biological conditions, you get convergent evolution, and this is certainly an example. Now, according to some of the voice actors and the differences in the recordings, we know there was a major restart in production on Ace Combat 7 in 2017, and by major, I mean quite significant. Based on even the True Sky presentation, we know the original vision for Ace Combat 7 was far more committed one than what we got. Weather was to play a far more significant and present role. There were significant alterations to try and get it working. All the while as well, a very baseline engine had to be built up in Unreal. It is unlikely any significant amount of assets could truly be converted at all from older engines, unlike Infinity, that being the one first developed from 6 almost a decade prior by 7's development. This meant time spent modeling plane after plane, perhaps one of the most time-consuming processes for a title like Ace Combat. Additionally, aspects like the Unreal Engine skybox had to be grappled with and altered for the game that needs massive open spaces as a rule of law. Perhaps one of the biggest contributing factors to this was technology. Just like the Namco System 21 revolutionized arcade machines, we are currently right in the middle of the early days of consumer-grade virtual reality. Looking back at some of these articles, the wording is always very vague. As Sony is attempting to gain an early foothold itself in the VR market, it initially appeared that Ace Combat would be a prime candidate for such technology. We can see this shift almost perfectly lines up with the restart of development. In 2015, it was announced Ace Combat 7 would be a PSVR exclusive, meaning it would firmly be on the PS4 only and anchor in the PlayStation's VR lineup. By 2016 already, though, the story was changing. Kono mentions they were facing difficulties getting virtual reality working and had to split it off to focus on 2 developments. It mentions as well some of the normal challenges to getting VR working, like motion sickness. Then, a while later in 2017, you can clearly see the story has changed. The PSVR content would be an isolated element, separate from the main campaign, more or less lining up with the scrapping of significant sections of the game. In addition, it would now ultimately add up to several hours of gameplay. By this 2018 article, the VR aspect is no longer even a front-running priority, so much as side novelty. Now, I don't think every technology was especially difficult to get working, but it's a good benchmark of how things shifted. Once again, this project was originally from 2012, existing under Namco, who would likely be more than happy for a nice profitable free-to-play gacha game, and which likely only went through with the go-ahead on 7 thanks to additional funding brought in through ACI and through financiers convinced it was worth a shot. Going by my gut, I know pretty much exactly what happened in 2017. Someone from corporate came down and said it was time to tighten their belts, rein in the ambition, get what works working and ditch the rest. All of this has happened before and will happen again. And so, a project already theoretically proposed 5 years prior and started dev 2 years before still needed another 2 years to get things working. For those that don't know, this is already an absurdly long dev cycle by modern standards. It would then take another 2 years to finalize to release in early 2019. This speaks of a project whose initial ideas were not taking root, and who had to dump fertilizer on the ones that were. A game that needed things brought in and finished, but very much got lost in its technology along the way. Now this was a lot, and we have not even begun on the game proper, but it is vital. And remember, it's a good thing this isn't a series, and that it was important to know all this before moving on anymore, because so much about these games' flaws can be attributed to these flawed production. So here it is. This is it, the line. What I have given you is basically why Ace Combat 7 is disappointing. but not how it is. Why the chain smoker is dying of leukemia, but not how it's specifically killing him. On the other side of that line is Ace Combat 7. So once again, big thanks to Keystone for digging so much, and I will mention more of his findings as relevant, but I'm saying it now. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. What ifs about alternate outcomes and cut content explain things, but don't change the underlying problems. What we got was Ace Combat 7, warts and all. Now hey, if you made it this far, and you are of a gentler folk, if you look away when the little baby carriage rolls in front of the cars, you can stop right now, leave the video, go for a walk. Otherwise, I said we would get surgical, and it's time to get surgical. We will go through the campaign, but this is not a summary, just a means of working through the many points I have in some order. If you feel this review is too long, take a break. I will timestamp the sections in the description. Feel free to go and come back later. If you still feel this video is too long, sorry, you're just too impatient. It took me about 15 hours worth of documentaries to have what I feel is a good grasp on the Yugoslav Balkan conflicts. So an hour or two for a video game really hardly seems that long. So check your boots and gear and hold on, as I grab my scalpels and books on war philosophy because we are going in.